24 miles. That's all that separates the global economy from collapse. 24 miles of warm, shallow water between Iran and Oman, shaped like a lazy S-curve, barely wide enough to fit 2 lanes of tanker traffic moving in opposite directions. Every single day, roughly 80 to 100 ships squeeze through this corridor. They carry approximately 20% of the world's oil and a fifth of all liquefied natural gas traded on the planet. For decades, military strategists, energy analysts, and foreign policy experts have asked the same question. What happens if someone actually shuts down the Strait of Hormuz? Well, we don't have to wonder anymore, because on March 2nd, 2026, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made a radio announcement that sent shockwaves through every trading desk on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, they declared, was closed. Any ship that entered would be set on fire, and they meant it. To understand why this narrow strip of ocean holds the entire world hostage, you need to understand what flows through it. It's not just oil, though the oil alone would be enough to terrify you. Nearly 15 million barrels of crude pass through the strait every day, coming from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. That's more than a quarter of all seaborne oil trade on the planet. China gets roughly a third of its entire oil supply through this single choke point. India, Japan, South Korea, they're all critically dependent on this waterway. If you live in Asia, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just some geopolitical concept on a map. It's the artery that powers your factories, heats your homes, and moves your economy. Cut it, and the patient starts bleeding out within days. But oil is only half the story. Qatar, the world's second largest LNG exporter, ships virtually all of its natural gas through the strait. There is no pipeline alternative, no workaround, no plan B. If the strait closes, Qatar's gas doesn't get rerouted. It simply doesn't leave. Europe, which gets somewhere between 12 and 14% of its LNG from Qatar, suddenly has a massive gap in its energy supply. Asia gets hit even harder. And when LNG vanishes from the global market, the cascading effects don't stop at energy. Fertilizer production depends on natural gas. Fertilizer shortages drive up food prices. Food price spikes create political instability. You start with a narrow waterway, and you end up with protests in countries that most people couldn't find on a map. This is the domino effect that keeps energy ministers awake at 3 in the morning. Now, Iran has threatened to close the strait before, many times actually. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, both sides turned the Persian Gulf into a shooting gallery in what became known as the Tanker War. Iraq attacked Iranian oil tankers. Iran retaliated by attacking ships belonging to Iraq's allies. Over the course of 7 years, more than 400 commercial vessels were hit. Sailors died. Billions in cargo were destroyed. It was the most sustained assault on merchant shipping since the Second World War. And yet, and this is the critical point, even during all of that chaos, Iran never actually closed the strait. Came close. It laid mines, it harassed vessels, it fired missiles at tankers. But the waterway stayed open because Iran itself depended on it. Iran needed the strait to export its own oil. Closing it would have been economic suicide. That calculation held for 40 years. Every time tensions spiked, in 2012, in 2019, in 2024, analysts would say the same thing. Iran won't do it. They can't afford to. The threat is a bargaining chip, not a real strategy. And for 40 years, that analysis was correct until it wasn't. What changed was the nature of the conflict itself. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran that made every previous escalation look like a warm-up act. Operation Epic Fury, as the Pentagon called it, struck hundreds of targets across the country. Military installations, missile production facilities, nuclear sites, government ministries, and the compound of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Khamenei was killed in the strikes. Dozens of senior officials were killed alongside him. Iran's navy was systematically destroyed, with at least 17 warships sunk in the opening days. The IRGC's drone carrier, a converted container ship capable of launching long-range Shahed drones, was taken out within hours. By March 3rd, U.S. Central Command reported that there wasn't a single Iranian ship still operating in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, or the Gulf of Oman. Oman. On paper, Iran's conventional military was shattered. Its navy was gone. Its air defenses were degraded. Its leadership was decapitated. By every traditional measure of military power, Iran had lost. But here's the thing about asymmetric warfare. You don't need a navy to close a strait. You don't need a fleet or an air force or a sophisticated command structure. You just need drones. Cheap, expendable, terrifyingly effective drones. And Iran had thousands of them. What happened next was something that Pentagon planners had studied in theory, but never confronted in practice. Iran didn't try to blockade the strait with warships. It didn't need to deploy submarines or establish a naval cordon. Instead, the IRGC launched selective drone strikes in the vicinity of the strait. A tanker was hit near Oman. Another was set ablaze. The attacks weren't massive in scale. They didn't need to be, because the real weapon wasn't the drones themselves. The real weapon was fear. Within hours of the first attacks, insurance companies began pulling coverage for vessels transiting the strait. War risk premiums, which had already been climbing in the weeks before the strikes, exploded. For a very large crude carrier, a single transit through the strait now carried an insurance surcharge of $250,000, and that was before the shooting started in earnest. Once Iranian drones actually started hitting ships, insurers simply refused to cover the passage at any price, and without insurance, shipping companies won't sail. It's that simple. A supertanker is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No executive is going to send one through a combat zone without coverage. This is what one analyst called an insurance-driven shutdown, and it caught almost everyone off guard. Military planners had spent decades preparing for an Iranian naval blockade. Mines, missiles, fast attack boats. They had contingency plans for all of it. What they didn't plan for was a scenario where Iran didn't need to physically block the strait at all. A handful of drone strikes created enough risk to make the world's insurers and shipping companies voluntarily shut down one of the most critical trade routes on Earth. If you're finding this deep dive into geopolitics as fascinating as I do, make sure you're subscribed. I spend way too many hours staring at shipping lane data and reading insurance premium reports, so you don't have to. Hit that subscribe button. Before the war, roughly 80 to 100 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz every day, about 50 going in, 50 coming out. By early March, that number had dropped to virtually zero. Tanker traffic fell approximately 70% in the first days and then flatlined. But more than 150 ships anchored outside the strait, waiting. Cruise ships were stranded, leaving around 15,000 passengers stuck at sea. Major container shipping lines, Maersk, CMA, CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits through the strait and related routes. And the ripple effects were immediate and brutal. Brent crude, which had been trading around $70 a barrel before the crisis, rocketed past $100 within days. It peaked above $119, a 3.5-year high. As of right now, it's hovering around $109. WTI crude followed the same trajectory. Natural gas prices in Europe and Asia surged even more sharply because, unlike oil, there's no pipeline alternative for the LNG that flows through Hormuz. But the pain wasn't limited to energy traders staring at screens. Iraq, one of the world's largest oil producers, started shutting down production at its biggest fields. Not because they were attacked, not because they chose to, but because without the ability to export through the strait, they literally had nowhere to put the oil. Storage tanks filled up, pipelines backed up, production had to stop. The International Energy Agency estimated that Gulf countries have been forced to cut total oil production by at least 10 million barrels per day, making this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Larger than the 1973 Arab oil embargo, larger than the Iranian Revolution of 1979, larger than the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Nothing in modern history compares. Now you might think the obvious solution is what the United States did during the 1980s tanker war. Send in the Navy, escort the ships through, and dare Iran to fire on a U.S. warship. And that's exactly what President Trump proposed. On March 3rd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would provide escorts and that the government's Development Finance Corporation would offer political risk insurance to shipping companies willing to make the transit. The solution sounded straightforward. It had worked before, but the Strait of Hormuz of 2026 is not the Strait of Hormuz of 1987. In the 1980s, the U.S. Navy's fleet was twice the size it is today. Iran's weapons were comparatively primitive. Machine guns, RPGs, early-generation anti-ship missiles. The reflagging operation, where Kuwaiti tankers sailed under American flags and received U.S. Navy escorts, was a success because the threat level was manageable. U.S. warships could credibly deter Iranian fast boats and deal with scattered mines. Today, Iran's weapons are far more sophisticated. Its drone technology, battle-tested in conflicts across the Middle East, can be launched from dispersed positions along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. It has deployed sea mines in the Strait, reportedly fewer than a dozen, but even a small number of mines in such a narrow waterway creates enormous risk. Defense officials have described the Strait as an Iranian kill box. Navy officials reportedly told journalists that escorts aren't currently feasible because Iran can still attack ships, even with its conventional navy destroyed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff acknowledged the progress in degrading Iranian capabilities, but admitted it remains a tactically complex environment, and there's a logistics problem that nobody talks about. More than 300 ships are currently stranded in the Persian Gulf. Even if the Navy began escort operations tomorrow, the process of safely moving all of those ships through the Strait would take months, possibly years. One commodity analyst estimated that the cost of a single naval escort would exceed the value of the cargo being protected. So if the Navy can't simply punch its way through, what are the alternatives? There are a few, but none of them are good. Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline, which can move crude from the Persian Gulf to Red Sea ports, bypassing the Strait entirely. Its capacity is roughly 5 million barrels a day, with a theoretical maximum of 7 million. The UAE has a pipeline that moves about 1.5 million barrels daily to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, which sits just outside the Strait. Combined, these pipelines offer maybe 3 to 3.5 million barrels of spare capacity that could bypass Hormuz. That sounds helpful until you remember that roughly 20 million barrels a day were flowing through the Strait before the war. Pipeline alternatives can replace maybe 15 to 20% of lost capacity. The rest simply disappears from the market, and even those alternatives are under threat. In March, drones struck Oman's deep-water port of Duqm and the port of Salalah, both of which were being discussed as potential bypass routes. A fuel storage tank in Duqm was damaged. Sohar, another Omani port, fell within an insurer's war risk zone, driving up costs for any ship trying to use it. The UAE's port of Fujairah was hit in a separate wave of attacks targeting energy infrastructure, with fires and thick smoke rising from oil facilities. Iran has been systematically targeting the bypass options, closing escape routes one by one. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened that revealed the raw geopolitics underneath the crisis. On March 4th, reports emerged that Iran was selectively allowing certain ships through the Strait. Chinese vessels were given passage first, a nod to Beijing's position as the largest buyer of Iranian oil and its calls for protecting global shipping. A bulk carrier operated by a Shanghai-based company transited the Strait while broadcasting that it was Chinese-owned. A Turkish-operated LPG tanker announced itself as Muslim-owned and sailed through unharmed. By March 5th, the IRGC formally announced that the Strait was closed only to ships from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. This was a masterstroke of asymmetric diplomacy. Iran weaponized access to the Strait, turning it into a tool for rewarding allies and punishing enemies. China gets its oil. Turkey gets its gas. The West gets nothing. In one move, Iran fractured the potential coalition that might have united to reopen the waterway. Why would China send warships to secure a strait that's already open to Chinese ships? Why would Turkey join a military operation when its vessels are sailing through freely? The consequences for the developing world are devastating. Many countries across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia depend on imported energy, fertilizers, and food commodities that flow through or are priced by the Strait of Hormuz. Higher oil prices push up the cost of everything: transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, electricity. For countries already struggling with debt, inflation, and limited access to finance, this kind of supply shock isn't just an inconvenience, it's an existential threat to political stability. The UN Trade and Development Agency warned that the ripple effects extend far beyond the region, affecting energy markets, maritime transport, and global supply chains, with particular risks for the most vulnerable economies. And it's not just the Persian Gulf that's affected. When the war broke out, a Houthi-controlled Yemen announced it would resume attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. This forced traffic that normally transits the Suez Canal Canal to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to journey times and dramatically increasing shipping costs. So now you have two of the world's most critical maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, simultaneously disrupted. The global shipping network doesn't have enough slack to absorb both at the same time. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, has publicly declared that the strait should remain closed and that Iran will not back down. He's vowed to open unspecified new fronts in the war if the US and Israel continue their campaign. The regime's calculus has fundamentally shifted, so when Iran had something to lose, its oil exports, its economic connections, its diplomatic leverage, closing the strait was unthinkable. Now, with its military decimated, its leader killed, its cities under bombardment, Iran has arrived at exactly the scenario that analysts always feared, a regime with nothing left to lose. The irony is almost poetic. For decades, the threat of closing Hormuz was Iran's most powerful deterrent, a card it could play to keep adversaries at bay without ever having to use it. The moment someone called that bluff with overwhelming force, Iran had no reason not to play it. The deterrent became the weapon, and the weapon turns out to be far more effective than anyone imagined. Not because of Iran's military strength, but because of the fragility of the system it targets. Because here's what this crisis has exposed in the starkest possible terms. The global economy, all $9-point-something trillion of annual trade that passes through the world's maritime choke points, rests on a breathtakingly thin foundation. A few narrow waterways, a functioning insurance market, and the assumption that major powers will keep the sea lanes open. Remove any one of those pillars, and the entire structure wobbles. Remove two or three, and it starts to crack. The Strait of Hormuz is 24 miles wide. The shipping lane itself is even narrower, 2 miles in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer. The entire system of global energy trade that supports billions of lives runs through a corridor that you could cross in a speedboat in under 30 minutes. And right now, nothing is moving through it. Some analysts see a path to de-escalation. Back-channel talks between the US and Iran have been reported. Iraq's oil minister has said he's in contact with Tehran about allowing ships to pass. The International Energy Agency coordinated the release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves to ease the supply crunch. OPEC Plus agreed to increase output by roughly 200,000 barrels per day, and the EIA forecasts that prices will eventually fall below $80 a barrel later in the year, assuming the conflict winds down. But those are assumptions, and assumptions have a bad track record in the Middle East. The war has entered its third week. Strikes continue. Iran's new leadership shows no signs of capitulating. The US military admits it hasn't yet secured the strait. China and Turkey are exploiting the fractures. Oil sits above $100 a barrel. LNG markets are in turmoil. Fertilizer supplies are threatened. Food prices are climbing. And the shipping industry, the invisible infrastructure that moves 90% of everything you own, is watching and waiting for a signal that it's safe to sail again. That signal hasn't come. One miscalculation in the strait, one mine that detonates under the wrong tanker, one drone that hits a vessel carrying liquefied natural gas in one of the most ecologically sensitive waterways on the planet. And the crisis that already qualifies as the worst energy disruption in modern history could become something far, far worse. The world built its economy on the assumption that 24 miles of water between Iran and Oman would always remain open. That assumption just died. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this video informative. If you want to see more content like this, where we break down the geography behind the world's biggest crises, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It really makes a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on GlobeWatch.